as we kickstart the new year, I am just so honored to be able to speak to you today on a word that we often feel so deeply inside, but yet externally often fail to communicate. And that one word is failure. You know, I've always wondered why some people seem invincible, almost superhuman, right? You know, those people who seem to be able to bounce back from anything, those people who could face critical illness, a job retrenchment, in the midst of a pandemic like COVID-19, those who lose their nearest and dearest, you know, met with boom, failure after failure after failure, and yet somehow still remain optimistic, motivated, positive, and driven. And you're here just thinking, you know, as an onlooker, you're thinking, how is it possible that so much, you know, negative stuff has happened to this person, and yet they still retain their sense of positivity, their drive, and, you know, their motivation? Of course, then there's also the other side of the coin, right? Those who are healthy, you know, have a stable job, even in the midst of an economic recession like what we're facing now, you know, those who are surrounded by just so many loved ones. And yet when one tiny thing goes wrong at work, you know, and when one person says no to them, just one little event of the day, they seem to, on the other hand, have been hit by a tsunami or a flood, right? They just freeze. They're unable to get up. They're dejected. They're disappointed. They're paralyzed, you know, from that failure, even though many things in your life are going right. And I've just always wondered, right? Why do some people seem entirely unaffected and invincible to failure, while other people just become, you know, paralyzed and seem to drown in the face of failure, right? What fundamentally makes these two groups different? Are they that different? How are they different? And why are they different? And that leads me to my first point today, which is all about rejection, right? Where did this fear of rejection, where did this fear of failure even come from, right? And when we look at failure, especially in the workplace, rejection is one word that commonly comes up so much, right? And for those of you who have ever been in a sales role, or those of you who are currently in a sales role, the impact of that failure, of that rejection of a client saying no to you is direct, right? The impact of that failure, the impact of that rejection is direct. A client said no. But why are we so afraid of rejection? I'd like to suggest that rejection is intimately intertwined with failure, right? And that it's not only that rejection is intimately intertwined with failure, but that there's an emotional connection to it. And that emotion is fear, right? Rejection is associated to failure, which is associated to an emotional reaction of fear. If I were to ask you right here, right now, right, just close your eyes for a second, right, and think of the word failure, okay? My guess is that you probably wouldn't be feeling too good right now digging that image up, right? Your last memory of rejection hits hard. Your last memory of failure hits hard, whether it's 2 years, 2 months, 2 days, or maybe even 2 hours ago that you last experienced this feeling, right? It could be that time that that client rejected you. It could be that time where a longtime friend, you know, thought you weren't good enough and pushed you away, right? It could be that time a loved one you trusted so deeply just walked away from you without rhyme or reason, right? And each time, every single time, whether in personal life, whether in the workplace, or in other situations, we often associate rejection to failure, which comes with this emotional response of fear. Like, I'm scared. I don't want to face this. I don't know what to do, right? This fear. And so my second point here with regards to rejection, failure, and fear is I want to know, where did this fear come from, right? There is this pervasive fear of failure in society and in culture, especially in Asian culture, right? And I want to be talking about this rejection, this fear of failure. And the first thing that I want you to consider and that I want you to know is that it's not natural. This fear of failure is not natural, but it is thought. Okay. When a child is playing, in a playground and they fall down, they don't think, oh my God, I failed. I'm not a good human being, right? I don't have any self worth anymore, right? They simply get up. They might cry a little bit, but then they simply get up and they run to the slide again and they start playing again, right? So this failure, it does not impact their view fundamentally. This failure, them falling down, it does not impact their view of themselves. It does not impact their self-worth as an individual, right? It's just an isolated occurrence that happened. I fell, and it does not impact the way that they view themselves. So when did we learn actually to fear failure and rejection? And who is it that taught us to fear this, right? I can't pin it down, to be honest, on a singular individual, but it is a fact in society and in culture, and especially in Asian society, that we are taught by negative reinforcement rather than positive reinforcement in society, right? I want you now to think back to a time where you've personally experienced this for yourself, right? When someone else told you to fear something that you originally may not even have been that scared of. Originally, you may not have been that afraid of this thing, but someone else told you, hey, be scared, be afraid of this thing. For example, right? And I don't know if this sounds familiar to you. For example, if you don't study hard enough and if you don't get those straight A's, you'll end up sweeping the road. How many of you have heard this before? Raise your hand. Right? Let's be honest. How many of you have heard this before? Raise your hand. Right? And you were actually in this case, right? Maybe you were actually okay with not getting straight A's. Maybe B's are good enough for you or B pluses, right? But now they've made it a personal attack on your entire career life. If you don't get straight A's, you end up sweeping the road. And now there's so much more riding on it, right? It's not just an isolated singular event that happens. That exam is not just an isolated singular event, right? But there's so much more riding on it. The whole personal worth of your entire career life is like riding on it. And obviously you'll be scared, right? Things like, if you don't get that promotion and be able to provide for your family, you won't be able to find a wife or you won't be able to find a husband, you might actually be okay with not getting that promotion immediately, right? But now they've made it a personal attack on your family life, your future personal family life. And there's so much more riding on it than just, oh, that one promotion. No, it's the future of your whole family life. So when we look at where did this fear of failure really come from, right? It comes from a pervasive fear of failure in society and in culture that was taught to us. This didn't exist when we were 3 and we fell down in the playground. When we fell down, we failed. We don't think, oh, I'm a shitty human being as an individual, right? But it was taught to us. And then those expectations compounded, from ever since we were in school as a child, studying for A's, all the way into our careers and adulthood. And failure doesn't become just a singular event or occurrence, but failure becomes our identity. Our identity is riding on failure, and that's why we learn to become so afraid of this one word, failure, because it's not a singular occurrence, but our identity and our self-worth is actually riding on it, right? Obviously, naturally, we're stressed, we're anxious, and we're very scared of this thing, right? If our personal identity is tied to it, right? And when we look at the fear of failure, us being so scared of failure, what is the true cost, right? So a lot of people think that, oh, I fear failure because, I'm afraid of not getting somewhere perfect. I'm afraid of not getting to where I want to be in my life, in my career. But the true cost of failure is actually so much more than that. The fear of failure prevents us from actually growing, actually improving. And what does this mean? This means stagnation, right? In the long run, okay? Not getting something perfect in the immediate interim is actually okay. But being so paralyzed by this imperfection, being so paralyzed, frozen with fear by this shortcoming, so much so that it prevents you from getting back up again, from standing on your 2 feet again. That is tragic. And that impacts you in the long term. This is your mindset towards failure. You stagnate, you stop growing. You're so scared that you just don't get back up. You don't even try again because you're so scared. And knowing that this is so important, right? How do we then actually overcome this fear of failure, this fear of rejection, right? We've talked about where did this fear of failure come from, right? Rejection is linked to fear of failure, which is linked to fear. And fear of failure was taught to us by society, right? And the true cost of failure is not just not getting somewhere perfect this time, but long-term stagnation and no growth in the long term as well. So knowing this, how do we overcome the fear of failure? How do we overcome rejection, right? So overcoming the fear of failure can be done in 3 ways. Number one, you can overcome the fear of failure by realizing that failure of an event is isolated. And this does not mean that you have a failed identity, right? What this means is that you can define failure for yourself and what that means to you, right? We may not originally fear failure, but as I mentioned, society sometimes makes it almost impossible for us not to be afraid of rejection, not to be afraid of failure, right? So if you look at it this way, right, to give you a real life example, when we fail at a project, a pitch, a client deal, right, we don't think, oh no, I failed this January pitch, right? We think, oh no, I am a failure. I'm not good enough, right? And society makes failure not just an event that happens, but an imposition on your personal identity. And we, as human beings in society, we internalize it and we believe it too. And that is why this hits us so hard, because failure is not something that happens, but rather I have failed as a person. Right? So if we look at it this way, what can we do about it? The first step is really realizing that we can define for ourselves what failure really means, right? Failure of an event is not the same and is not equal to the failure of you as a whole individual. And realizing that often failure or something that goes wrong has nothing to do with you as a person, as an individual. A failed event does not mean that you as a person has failed, right? So when we don't have the weight, the pressure of our entire identity riding on this failure, then it's a lot easier for us to accept and to come to terms with failure, because it's just an isolated event. It's just something that happens. We don't have the whole weight of our future, of our identity, of our careers, of our families riding on that one event, right? It's just one isolated event that happens. So it becomes a lot easier to accept. So the first way to overcome fear of failure is by realizing that failure of an event is isolated from a failed identity. The two are not the same. The second way that you can overcome failure is by realizing that failure can actually be positive. And this applies both individually and in business. To give you an example, imagine if a client said no to you, right? What do we normally do when a client says no? We sense rejection, we sense failure, and instinctively we freeze up because we're scared. And what most people do when they're scared is they run away, right? Most people try to run away. Most people try to, just move on as soon as possible. But instead of doing that, here are some great practical things that you can actually think about, right? Failure actually helps you and your business grow. right? So most people run away instinctively when something goes wrong. Most people don't revisit where they went wrong. But the thing is that if you don't revisit where you went wrong, you will never improve and you're limiting your own potential, right? And so when you face failure, the last thing you should do is to backtrack immediately and pretend it never happened and move on and run away, right? Instead, what you should do is just stay at the failure, look at it head on and ask yourself, what went wrong, right? What went wrong here? What could possibly be better, right? Many people are going to give excuses to say, but I really don't know what went wrong. I really don't know why this client rejected me. So ask them. It's really not that difficult, right? In fact, going back to ask for genuine feedback after an outright rejection, although it feels counterintuitive, could actually bring you more business growth. For example, like referrals, future re-inquiries, and so on, right? Because clients will also come to respect you and trust you for it. They can see that you're someone who genuinely seeks to improve your craft and not just someone who's there to make a quick buck, right? An overwhelming majority of the people, they don't truly want to know where they went wrong. They just want to get the sale. And then once the sale doesn't happen, they couldn't care less, right? So if you show the opposite attitude from this 99%, you already stand out, right? It's a crowded marketplace and client relationships matter today more than ever. That trust, that respect, that relationship matters so much more today than ever before, right? And so you really want to be memorable to a client and your view towards failure, right? You going back to ask for feedback when someone says no instead of just running away instinctively, that failure and the way you deal with it can actually be positive both to you individually and also in business, right? So the third way that you can overcome failure is by realizing that failure is actually not in the way of your success, but it is on the way to your success. It is fact, right? It's not an opinion. It is fact that all successful leaders in their field has been through failure, right? I'm willing to bet you 1,000%. If you look at your manager, you look at your director, you look at your CEO, everyone who has been successful in their field that has truly worked hard for it to achieve its success, they have been through failure. And so what this means is that if all successful people have been through failure, right, you have to reconcile and recognize the fact that if you don't want failure, you have to acknowledge this and reconcile this with the fact that you don't want success. And I'll repeat this. If you don't want failure, you have to acknowledge and reconcile this with the fact that you don't want success. Right? We've heard this theoretically so many times. If you don't fail, you can't succeed. But to really internalize the fact that, look, if I'm not able to go through failure, or I'm not willing or able to go through failure, to go through this tough patch, what this means is that I have to acknowledge that I will not be able to be successful, right? It isn't just a random quote. It is a hard, real-life fact. Let that sink in for a little while, right? Your ability, guys, your ability to handle failure is an indicator of your likelihood and ability to achieve and manage success, right? If you can truly internalize this and you're looking at success in the long term, then you will truly learn to embrace failure. Instead of like, and why did this happen? I'm not good enough. You will replace these thoughts with, look, here's another opportunity for me to improve my craft, right? Or, wow, here's another way for me to level up. Or, I am now one step closer to becoming the best version of myself and reaching success, right? And this is another way failure is positive for you and your success, right? So the 3 ways to get over failure, right? What did we say? Overcoming the fear of failure by realizing that failure is an isolated event and it does not equate to a failed identity, right? 2, you can overcome the fear of failure by realizing that failure can be positive for you in business, both individually and for you in business with your clients. And the third way to overcome failure is by realizing that failure is truly not in the way, but on the way to success. All successful people have to overcome failure. And if you don't, and if you can't deal with the latter, you can't have the former, right? Think about that. And so the third theme that I want to be talking about today is how do we actually move from fear of failure, from fear of rejection, into this personal power, into embracing rejection, embracing failure, and moving into personal power, right? And I want to be talking specifically about social media and the role of failure and rejection in building a powerful personal brand, right? Failure can help to build a powerful personal brand because people relate to failure. People relate to failure universally. It doesn't matter where in the world you are, and deeply. We have an emotional connection to failure, right? And social media is a unique space where failure and success is seen more starkly and more acutely than ever before, right? Everyone shares about success. Everyone flexes their wins. And yet the one people relate to the most deeply is failure rather than success. Ironically, people are constantly thinking of ways to stand out or to be different in a hyper-saturated online market, yet afraid to be truly raw and honest, right? But if you are able to dissociate failure from your personal identity and build a powerful brand, your ability to actually dissociate failure from your personal identity allows you to actually share about failures and to share about fears with no shame, because this failure is just something you experience. It's an isolated event, and it's something that happened, a lesson you can learn. And this does not invalidate or undermine your personal identity or your personal self-worth as a complete individual, right? So you're able to share about it. Your view of failure can impact your ability to share about failure, something that people resonate so deeply with, and to build a powerful personal brand, right? If you look at failure, this is something that people fear so much. People think about it so much, right? And are so afraid to talk about it. But yet, they are so excited and always look forward to hearing other people talk about it. And if you look at why people relate to personal brands like Gary Vaynerchuk, Tony Robbins, David Goggins, because you're not afraid to speak about failure openly, right? It's something that everybody experiences, yet somehow no one really speaks about it. Failure is universally felt. And at the end of the day, in a marketplace, while building a personal brand, in an online marketplace that is so crowded, that is so saturated, people will end up working with you, not because you are far better than the next person, but because they relate to you and they like you as an individual, right? If you look at why you would want to get a new TV, right? You don't buy the TV from salesman A because salesman A is so much better at selling that TV than salesman B. They're essentially selling the same TV, right? You probably bought from salesman A because you relate to A, you like A, and you want to support A, right? So to build this sense of relatability, what better topic than to talk about than something that is universally and deeply felt, like failure, right? So instead of just sharing success after success after success, share a story of your failure today. I challenge you to share a story of your personal failure today, right? On social media. And you might just be surprised at the type of responses you get, right? So that's a personal challenge that I want to give you guys today, right? The next thing I want to talk about is redefining failure and what that means to you, right? How can we truly become invincible to fear? How can we truly become invincible to rejection, the fear of failure? Is by redefining and creating your own definition of what failure truly means to you, right? If the worst thing that rejection can bring is taking you one step closer to success, then you will be invincible and rejection cannot faze you. It cannot affect you in any way, right? If rejection is just a singular event, an isolated incident that is not tied to your self-worth, it does not mean you're a horrible individual, but merely a lesson so you can move all the more further upwards, then you become immune to failure because you are no longer afraid of it, right? If you define failure that way, if you define rejection that way. And the only way really to overcome failures is to directly face your fears. And you know what the funny thing is? The funny thing is that when we actually do that, when we actually face our fears head on, the worst case scenario is often not as bad as we anticipated, right? So for example, if a client says no to you today, right, our minds immediately think, I'm a failure, I'm gonna get fired, my boss is gonna kill me, when actually what happens in real life is, if when a client says no, we're able to separate this rejection, this failure from our self-worth and identity, and even ask for feedback on why can I understand why you rejected this offer. I totally get it, but do you mind if I get feedback on it? How can I improve, right? If you do your market research and you actually share this with your team, with your manager might actually give you good feedback. And so often, things are really, really not as bad as we think, right? We overhype failure because we're so conditioned to fear it. We instinctively are just scared of it without even thinking like, why are we scared of it? What's our definition of failure? And can we redefine it? We don't even think that. We just overhype failure in our heads because we're so conditioned to fear it and that we're so afraid of it, too afraid of it. And we're often more afraid of the unknown than what the real life worst case scenario actually is. And like I said, when we face failure head on upfront, we often realize that, hey, actually, you know what? This is not as bad as I thought it would be, right? So face failure head on and redefine what failure actually means to you, right? So to recap, what did we talk about today, right? When we talk about fear, failure, and personal power and rejection, we talked about in the first part, where did the fear of failure even come from? We talked about rejection being linked to failure, being linked to fear, right? Fear of failure is connected with an emotional reaction, right? That's fear. And this was not natural, but taught to us by society ever since we were little kids, right? All the way into adulthood. And we also talked about how the true cost of failure is not getting something perfect this time, but actually, if you're so scared of failure, the true cost is so much more than that. It's long-term stagnation and no growth in the long term, which is pretty scary. So with this in mind, we talked about part 2, right? How do we overcome the fear of failure? We can overcome it in 3 ways. Number 1, we can overcome the fear of failure by realizing that failure of an event is isolated. It's a singular event. It does not equate to a failed identity, right? You can define failure for yourself and what that means to you. The second way we can overcome failure is by realizing that failure can actually be positive, both for you and your business, depending on how you look at it, right? The third way is to overcome failure by realizing that, hey, look, failure is not in the way, but failure is on the way to your success, right? All successful people have to overcome failure. And if you can't deal with the former, you can't have the latter, right? Think about that. And part 3, so we talked about how can we move from fear of failure, fear of rejection, into personal power and building a powerful personal brand, right? Number 1 is that failure can help build a powerful personal brand because people relate to failure. If